Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Lindsay Chervinsky. I am a professor at the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington, and I'm delighted to talk with you today about the cabinet, George Washington, and the creation of an American institution. I'm really looking forward to sharing some information and then engaging in some conversation and answering your questions a little bit later this evening. Any conversation about the cabinet, of course, has to start with the Constitution, because as astute readers, I'm sure you have noticed that the word cabinet is nowhere in the Constitution. So naturally, we kind of have to start with the Constitutional Convention and figure out why that happened in that particular way. So the delegates to the Constitutional Convention were extremely concerned about the British cabinet. They were very worried that they would replicate the lack of transparency, the corruption, and the cronyism that they saw in the British cabinet, and they really wanted to avoid that type of system. So they actually explicitly rejected several proposals for a cabinet or an executive council, and it came up time and time again over the summer, and they shot it down. Now, in this picture, as you can tell, the person that's highest in the photo is George Washington. He was the president of the Constitutional Convention. He was there for every single session. He didn't miss a single day. Many times after the end of the day's official proceedings, he would go out to tea or dinner or listen to music or go dancing or go horseback riding or go to dinner with many of the other delegates and the leading families in Philadelphia. Now, we don't have a record of what their conversations were about per se, but my money is that the subject of the day, the discussions in the convention, probably came up, which is to say that Washington had a very good sense of what the delegates expected the first president to do. And of course, that meant that he had a very good sense of what they expected him to do, because everyone knew that if the Constitution was ratified, he was going to be the first president. So he knew that no cabinet was permitted in the Constitution. However, the delegates were reasonable men, and they understood that no one person can be expected to have all the answers or to govern alone. And so they did put two key provisions into the Constitution to provide support and advice for the president in times of crisis or when a tricky issue came up. So the first key important clause is in Article 2 of the Constitution. I'm sure it's something you've heard before. It says that the president shall have the power with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties and foreign appointments. Now, this clause was crafted with great intention. That advice part they meant quite literally. They didn't expect the Senate to become sort of a veto or a rubber stamp, which it often is today on the president's foreign policy, in which the president will go sort of do things independently and then bring it to the Senate, and they will either say yay or nay. Instead, they expected that the senators would serve as a council of foreign affairs, which sounds a little bit less ridiculous if you keep in mind that only 22 senators were actually seated in the fall of 1789 when Washington first visited that body. So 22 senators, they figured they would be safe advisors. And I say safe because they knew that the state legislatures would be electing the senators, and they trusted the states to pick senators that would be smart, experienced, knowledgeable, and would be able to provide good advice for the president. And then they trusted the states to remove the senators if they gave bad advice. So they really hoped that this institution would be a safe advisory body and one that had transparency in terms of how these conversations took place. So with those expectations in mind, as soon as Washington took office, he anticipated that he would have a visit to the Senate. And sure enough, just a couple of months into his presidency, Washington began to plan his first trip over. Now, because this was the first time, and there were so many firsts at that moment, Washington had to think through every single detail quite carefully. And in fact, he met with a committee to plan how he would be introduced, how he would enter the building, where would he sit, where would John Adams, who was the president of the Senate in his capacity as the vice president, sit? How would they interact? I mean, all of these things that seem maybe a little bit silly or like unnecessary details, until you have to do them for the first time. And then you realize just how many of these decisions have to be made. Washington was planning to send delegates to an upcoming peace commission. And so he knew there were going to be representatives from North Carolina, South Carolina, and the Creek and Cherokee nations. In order to provide his federal government representatives with instructions, he wanted to talk to the Senate about what he should say. He had never given this type of instruction before, and because he was dealing with Native nations, in theory, he thought of this as foreign policy. But to make sure the senators were prepared, he also sent them all existing treaties that the United States had signed with Native American nations so that they could be prepared and they could have their homework done for when he first arrived. So the day officially arrived in August of 1789. He arrived at Federal Hall in New York City. The Senate chambers were actually on the first floor of this building. His name was announced, as well as that of the acting Secretary of War, Henry Knox, who Washington had brought to answer any questions or provide any other details, because he had actually overseen many of those treaties in his capacity as Secretary of War. Washington read the prepared address that he had brought with him and a series of questions that were designed to sort of spark debate, to encourage the senators to provide their opinions and their advice. He waited patiently, and instead he was met with silence. Some of the senators sort of shuffled their papers and twiddled their thumbs and tried to avoid eye contact as much as possible so that they wouldn't have to be called on. And eventually, William Maclay, a senator from Pennsylvania, stood up and said that this issue was new to them and they wanted to study it more and they wanted to refer it to committee. So could the president come back the following week for their recommendation? Washington was furious. He stood up and he yelled, "This defeats every purpose of my being here." Except he was, much bigger, much taller, much louder, and much scarier because this was the most famous man in the world. And here he was yelling at the senators. They all knew who he was, and they were not really very happy to be in his bad graces. He did eventually calm down, and he agreed to return the following week for their recommendation. But on the way out, he reportedly said that he would never again return for advice. Now, whether or not he actually said that, we don't have great evidence. It's a little bit, squishy, but he was definitely thinking it because he never again returned for advice. And no president since has ever gone to the Senate in that capacity. So just a couple of months into Washington's presidency, he's basically concluded that a key element of the Constitution is not going to work because foreign policy and diplomacy requires sort of immediate advice and consent and responses, and he needed help right away. But there was a second option, so he was then going to turn his mind to that option. Also in Article 2, it says the president may request written advice from the department secretaries about issues pertaining to their department. The delegates also crafted this clause with great care. So first, the president may require. He is not obligated to require, which means that the president does not have to get the input from the department secretaries before making a decision, and the president does not have to follow that advice. That was really important. Second, that advice is supposed to be in writing, and that was done to protect that transparency that they really felt was lacking with the British cabinet. Many of the delegates knew that the British cabinet existed. They knew there were people advising the king, but it wasn't clear really who had the king's ear, who had power at any given moment. There were no meeting notes taken, and they didn't like that. They felt that that was inappropriate for a Republican government. And this is, of course, little r Republican government. And finally, the president is supposed to request advice from the secretaries about their expertise matter. He's supposed to talk to them about things that they know something about, and that's to ensure that the president is getting good advice. Makes sense, right? You don't want necessarily the Secretary of the Treasury talking to you about matters of war or matters of state if they don't have any experience in those departments. So right away, Washington embraced this option. In fact, he asked the acting secretaries of the acting department secretaries left over from the Confederation Congress before he had the opportunity to appoint his own to create reports for him so he could study what was going on in their departments and make sure he was up to date on all of the information. And then as soon as his own nominees were in office in the fall of 1789, Jefferson was actually the last. He got into office in March of 1790. He started asking for written questions, or excuse me, written advice, written input. He would send them questions. But he very quickly realized that the issues that they were discussing were very complex. These were, matters of state that you were handling for the first time. So it was precedent setting, and it was really important to get it right. And today when we send text messages or emails, sometimes things get lost in translation, or maybe you forget to say something and then you send another email, and pretty soon you have an email chain that's a mile long. So imagine trying to do that and trying to discuss the issues on their plate with parchment and quill. You had to write out your letter. You had to let it dry. You had to have the letter hand delivered. You had to wait for the other person to read it, write out their reply, let that one dry, and then for it to be delivered back. And then what happened if you had follow-up questions? It was way too slow. There were way too many details to manage. And Washington knew that he needed something that was a little bit more flexible, a little bit more responsive. So what he started to do when he was at the president's house, and this is the president's house in Philadelphia, where Washington spent most of his presidency. Unfortunately, this building no longer exists, which is a real historical travesty. So I've actually recreated a 3D version of it just so you can kind of see the scope of the house. It was one of the biggest private homes in the city. It had sort of been added on over time, as you can see, and it was the center of so many diplomatic, social, political, economic firsts for this nation. And on the second floor there's a little building and a little room that was the president's private study. And it probably looked a little bit something like this. Now, I think he would have been a little bit more full of furniture because there were lots of bookcases, and the desk in the corner was actually 5 feet wide. So it was very stuffed, very crammed, and it was Washington's private space. And he used this private space to great effect. So what he would do is he would send a letter to the department secretaries. They would send a letter back, and then they would often bring that letter themselves so that they could nail out any other revisions or details to a letter or a policy. And those meetings almost always took place one-on-one in Washington's private study, where they could be sure that they would be without interruption and relatively little risk of being overheard by anyone else in the house. And Washington used this strategy for about 2.5 years. Now, let me emphasize that. 2.5 years, Washington had written advice and then the one-on-one meetings. And in fact, he did not include a cabinet meeting as part of his portfolio of tools until November 26, 1791. So the cabinet did not exist from day one, even though a lot of the people were the same. And he certainly did not intend to create a cabinet from day one. Otherwise, he wouldn't have waited quite so long. So Washington did convene his first meeting on this day, and the agenda was to discuss the diplomatic and economic relationships between the United States and France, Great Britain, and Spain. No small issues there. And the reason a cabinet meeting was so essential was because the enormity of these issues. Of course, they were going to touch on multiple different departments. If you're talking about diplomatic and economic relationships, you're going to talk to the Treasury Department and you're going to talk to the State Department. But then you're going to need to talk to the War Department if things don't go well. And you probably, if you're signing new agreements, ought to run those things by the Attorney General. So Washington convened this meeting to discuss the status of the relationship, and present at the first cabinet meeting from left to right were President George Washington, Secretary of War Henry Knox, Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, and Attorney General Edmund Randolph. Probably some names that you're familiar with. And of course, the cabinet meeting would have taken place in that same exact room. Now imagine 5 pretty big guys in this space, and there would have been a lot of furniture, and it would have been a pretty intense atmosphere. So Washington has a cabinet. Now he has to figure out what to do with it. There are no written guidelines about how to structure a cabinet meeting. There are certainly no models for which he can follow because, of course, he's trying to avoid the British cabinet as a model. So what does Washington do? he refers to his own leadership experience that had been so helpful during the Revolutionary War when he regularly convened councils of war with his officers and aides de camp to discuss strategy, important decisions, the location of winter encampments, battle plans, you name it. Washington met with his councils wherever his headquarters happened to be. So sometimes they were going to be in places like the Longfellow House in Cambridge, which was this big, beautiful building. Sometimes they were going to be in his campaign tent on the middle of the battlefield. Now, this campaign tent is amazing. Actually, the remnants still exist at the Museum of the American Revolution. And it was incredibly large for a campaign tent at the time, but it was still a tent, which meant there were no floors. There was going to be dirt underneath your feet. There were no screens or walls, so bugs were coming in and out. Maybe dogs were coming in and out. Horses were nearby. It would be very loud, probably pretty hot, very dirty, very smelly. And you had all of these people crammed into this space. So it was sometimes it was a really nice environment, and sometimes it probably wasn't a very nice environment. Now, Washington used his councils of war for three reasons. First, he used it to obtain political cover for potentially controversial decisions, like a major retreat. Second, he used it to build consensus among his officers about maybe where they should go for the winter or how they should go about implementing an attack. And third, of course, he used it to obtain advice. He recognized the value in hearing from people who had different experiences and knowledge than his own. However, the people that he was bringing together, they were not wallflowers. They had some pretty big egos. They had some pretty big ideas. They wanted to be listened to. They were very touchy about their own honor. And so Washington had to very deftly manage these personalities so it didn't sometimes turn into an all-out brawl. And he did so in a couple of ways. First, he would come up with a list of questions, and that list of questions would then be used as the meeting agenda to try and sort of keep people on point. Once he was in the meeting, if the officers disagreed or the aides de camp disagreed, he would ask for written opinions. And those written opinions were essential because they first allowed him to hear from everyone. Maybe Nathaniel Greene didn't really feel like battling with Charles Lee or Charles Lee's hounds because he had a tendency to bring his pack of dogs anywhere he went. And I have one hound, and I can tell you they are extraordinarily loud. So I cannot imagine how loud and disruptive an entire pack would have been in the middle of a council of war. So Washington had the written opinions to make sure he heard from everyone. And that was really important emotionally because they knew that he had solicited their opinion. Second, it allowed him to sort of consider the evidence more slowly, to think through what the different options were, to make sure he had understood what everyone was saying, to make sure he had understood all of the facts and the data. And it also allowed him to make decisions like he liked to make them, which was to study, to deliberate, to ponder, and then when he finally did make a decision, to implement with firmness and alacrity. Finally, if he ever needed it, he had written proof about who had said what. And so if he needed to prove that one of his officers had supported a decision, he had that written proof right there in his hand. So when Washington comes into his cabinet meetings, he comes into his discussions with his cabinet secretaries. What is he to do? Well, he basically copies and pastes everything from his councils of war directly into the cabinet. How does that work? So first, he uses cabinet meetings to obtain political cover for controversial decisions. He uses cabinet meetings to try and build consensus. And he uses cabinet meetings to, of course, obtain advice about things he didn't necessarily know about. He also uses the same strategies because if anyone has seen or listened to the Hamilton musical, you know that Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton did not particularly get along. And so by the time he's a couple of years into his presidency, they're bickering and fighting, and Washington has to do everything he can to hold it together with his hands. So he would come up with a list of questions. He would send those questions ahead of time so they could sort of deliberate on the advice they wanted to give. He would use those questions as the meeting agenda. And then, of course, if they disagreed, which frankly was more often than not, he would ask for written opinions. Now, I have to say, as an aside, as a historian, I'm delighted that they disagreed and wrote written opinions because that archival record is amazing. But for him, again, it was really important because it allowed him to study and to deliberate and to make a decision slowly. Washington almost never went into a cabinet meeting with his mind made up about what to do. He genuinely wanted the input first before making that choice. So let me give you a real-time case study example of how these strategies worked. In February of 1793, France declared war on Great Britain. And very quickly, the war spiraled into an international conflict that encompassed all of their allies and enemies and colonial holdings. But the United States was just a couple of years out of the Revolutionary War and was in no business trying to fight a war themselves. So they really could not afford to participate, whether it be environmentally, economically, emotionally, sort of physically, and even if they had wanted to fight, they did not have a navy or army with which to do so. So they literally had no tools with which to participate in this conflict, which was a little bit problematic because during the Revolution, the United States had signed a treaty with France, and it was a treaty of defense. And it basically said that if either were attacked by their enemies, which really meant Great Britain, the other would come to their aid. So Washington receives word that war has been declared. He sends a letter to his cabinet secretaries. He's at home at Mount Vernon. And he says, I want you to start thinking about what to do here, how we are going to handle this situation. So he gives them a heads up. He returns to Philadelphia and he calls a very important meeting after sending that list of questions that we discussed. And he asked them a series of questions about what he should do. So first, should the United States honor this treaty? And if so, how? Because they don't have an army or a navy. Second, is the United States' relationship with France altered? Because around this same time, of course, is the French Revolution. And as the Reign of Terror accelerated, the revolutionaries had executed King Louis, who had been the person that had signed this treaty with the United States. So Washington had legal questions about whether or not it was still enforced. And finally, if the United States wasn't going to participate, how does neutrality actually work? It sounds pretty simple. You just say, I'm staying out of the war, but there are actually a ton of very complex legal questions, both domestically and internationally. So for example, if you declare neutrality, that means that your citizens, in theory, are not allowed to participate in that conflict on either side. But what if they do? Who is supposed to enforce that? What laws are they breaking? What court is supposed to hear that case? Who is supposed to implement the punishment? These were just some of the questions on their plate. Internationally was particularly complex as well because various different players had other ideas about how the United States should act, including the gentleman on your screen, whose name was Citizen Edmond Genet, and he was the new French minister to the United States, who arrived in the US in April of 1793, right as the cabinet is beginning to meet and to discuss these questions. So the Washington administration does decide to declare neutrality. They decide to interpret the treaty with a nice little sleight of hand. It is a defensive treaty because France was not attacked. France did the attacking. Then the United States is not obligated to come to its aid. Now, even Thomas Jefferson, who was super pro-French as they came, agreed that neutrality was essential, that the United States could not get into the war. It would never recover. So Washington issues this proclamation, and Genet arrives in the United States and immediately says, no thanks. He has a very different interpretation. He says, okay, the United States doesn't have to actually fight in the war, but they can give us a lot of money to help us fight the war, and they can provide a lot of sort of material and situational support. And the way he figured that the United States would do that was to open its ports to his privateering activities. So privateers were private ships that were owned by an average citizen, usually a captain, that would receive letters of marque or licenses from a foreign nation. And how that would work would be an American captain, in theory, would have a ship, and Genet would provide this license and they would go out and attack British ships on behalf of the French, bring them back into port, sell off the goods that were on the British ship, and then turn that British ship into a new privateer or to sell it off for profit. Now, this was very common war practice in the 18th and early 19th centuries. All countries who were fighting did this. However, you can imagine that it was incredibly complicated for a neutral United States. If Genet was setting up basically a privateer factory in Philadelphia, that is not particularly neutral behavior. And so as part of the proclamation of neutrality, what Washington and the cabinet decided to do was to say that privateers could come into port to buy essentials, food, water, clothing. They could not buy any armaments or war materials like ammunition or things to improve their defenses, and they could not bring their captured bounties back into port to sell off. Now, in order to make these decisions, Washington had a series of cabinet meetings over the summer of 1793. He asked for the secretary's input. 1793 proved to be the high watermark for Washington's cabinet meetings, and the cabinet met 51 times in that year, up to 5 times per week, sometimes several hours per day, usually in Washington's small private study. Now, this issue sort of came to a head in early August because it was clear that Genet was not ceasing his activities and they had not gone on unnoticed. So this is a map of Philadelphia, roughly around 1790s, early 1800s. The star on the right was where the port of Philadelphia was. The star on the left was where Washington's house, the president's house, was located. There are only 6 blocks apart. So Washington knew what Genet was doing. Jefferson, as the Secretary of State, knew what Genet was doing, but so too did the British minister who was in Philadelphia, who didn't take particularly kindly to British ships being dragged into the port and then sold off for profit or turned into new French privateers. Now, maybe this would have been less of a problem if Genet's privateers weren't so darn successful, but they were really, really good. And they were having a lot of success attacking British ships, which was causing the Washington administration a huge problem. So they basically issued this ultimatum to Genet to stop. He ignored it. He continued to make a privateer, and then he had it sail out into the bay. So this was the final straw. Washington convened a cabinet meeting and said, what do we do about Genet? And the secretaries deliberated, they debated, they went back and forth, and finally they agreed unanimously, which was fairly unusual, that Genet needed to be recalled from France. This was a very big moment diplomatically because the United States had never requested the recall of a foreign minister, and frankly, they weren't really sure how France was going to respond. Now, when France did agree to the recall, that was a very important moment for the United States because it was a tacit acknowledgement that the United States was an independent nation, had the right to establish its own foreign policy, and the right to demand that it was respected by foreign ministers on American shores. So that was a huge sort of diplomatic precedent. But as this process was unfolding, we see some of the same strategies that Washington had used in his councils of war. First, he had requested the secretary's input because it was a totally new situation, and he genuinely wanted their advice about the legal, diplomatic, military implications of this decision. Second, he wanted to make sure they had consensus on this issue because it was such an important step. And indeed, they did develop consensus. Although it took several days, he often would stop the meetings partway through, go have a dinner, come back, try and sort of reset. But he achieved that consensus that he wanted. And finally, it was a pretty potentially politically controversial decision. Genet was very popular among Jeffersonian Republicans, especially, which was sort of this emerging opposition party. France was very popular among most Americans who had really treasured the alliance during the Revolution. And Washington wasn't really sure how the American people were going to respond to this choice. But he had those written letters just in case he needed evidence that the secretaries had supported this potentially controversial choice. So towards the end of Washington's presidency, the original secretaries began to retire. Jefferson was the first to go at the end of December 1793. Henry Knox retired at the end of 1794. Hamilton retired at the end of January 1795, and Edmund Randolph resigned in August of 1795. Now, Washington didn't particularly like the replacements as much as his original cabinet. I often affectionately refer to them as the B team. They weren't quite up to snuff. They weren't as talented or diplomatic. They certainly weren't as skilled, and I don't think Washington trusted them very much. In fact, he often complained about them in his letters, especially his letters to Alexander Hamilton. So towards the end of his presidency, he actually convened far fewer meetings, preferring one-on-one consultations, preferring to talk to people outside of the administration like Hamilton, or really trusting his own judgment. So the way the cabinet evolved in Washington's presidency really left some very important precedents that continue to guide the institution up through the 19th, 20th, and even into the 21st century. First, the cabinet is entirely under the president's control. The secretaries report to the president. He is entitled to remove them from office at will, and he's entitled to use the cabinet as he, or hopefully someday she, sees fit. If he wants to meet with department secretaries every day, great. If he prefers to get advice from other people and other relationships, other former colleagues, family members, friends, then the president is entitled to do that. Sort of related, the president has incredible flexibility over the cabinet. So if the cabinet is really helpful in some situations, fantastic. But if the president doesn't want to meet with them at other times, the secretaries do not have a right to demand to be in the room. They do not have a right to demand that their advice is followed. They can offer it, but it's ultimately up to the president to decide what to do. One other precedent that Washington established that seems sort of common sense, but is important to say, is that the president generally wants to avoid cabinet scandal. Secretaries show up most in the news when something is going wrong. And so if we don't pay a whole lot of attention to the secretaries, that generally means that things are working well behind the scenes and things are working smoothly. Scandal and a lot of turnover and a lot of sort of news coverage generally means that the administration's agenda is going to be disrupted, and the administration is not going to be as effective as it would be otherwise. And finally, Washington established a precedent for diversity, which might be kind of surprising, but we're going to get to that. And I think it will hopefully help you see the cabinet as a useful tool in a way that maybe you wouldn't otherwise. So first, presidential control. The presidents that have worked the best with their cabinets are ones that have not allowed too much discretion or too much sort of individual action outside of their oversight. Jefferson learned from his time in Washington's cabinet. He learned that he really, really hated the conflict and the debate that he had had with Hamilton. And in fact, he hated it so much that 20 years later, he described their interactions as a cockfight, which brings to mind a very bloody, gory, violent spectacle. And that's really how he felt about it. So when he had the opportunity to create his own cabinet, he was meticulous about organizing the details of their interactions. He never convened a cabinet if he thought that they would disagree or that it wouldn't be productive. He regularly talked with them one-on-one so that he knew exactly what they would say before they actually came into cabinet meetings. And he was fastidious about trying to cultivate good relationships, both between him and then between the secretaries themselves. So he asserted real control over every aspect of the cabinet, and it frankly actually worked. His cabinet was a remarkable tool for public outreach, congressional liaising. It was a very effective way for him to get his agenda done. And he had the least turnover of any two-term president in American history. So it was a very effective cabinet. Some other examples that I really like to include are Ulysses S. Grant and President Dwight D. Eisenhower. President Ulysses S. Grant really ran things with military hierarchy. He wanted the input of the secretaries. He listened to them. He cared what they had to say. But then once he made a decision, that was it. And some of the secretaries sort of grumbled about that, they never got to have their way. And he was, always in such firm command. But it was really important because the president is ultimately responsible for what happens in the departments. And as Truman said, sort of made this phrase famous, the buck stops here. But he's right. The buck literally does stop with the president when we're thinking about the cabinet and what happens in the department secretaries, or in the departments with the secretaries. Dwight D. Eisenhower is a really interesting case because he too had a very sort of militaristic, hierarchical approach to the executive branch. He did not cultivate this appearance outwardly, but inwardly and in private meetings, he knew everything that was happening in the departments. He delegated, but he was very careful about observing that delegation, and nothing was done without his knowledge. Now, as I said, he sort of cultivated an image outwardly that he was sort of old and maybe dottery and not really paying attention, and everything was sort of run by other people. But this was very much a political and diplomatic move. And so the way we know this is because as archives and materials have been declassified, the real picture has come out. So for example, just after he retired, in those presidential rankings that come out all the time, Eisenhower was really, really towards the bottom. He was like in the bottom 10. Now, in this most recent round of polls, he's in the top 5. And that's because people have begun to see just how much of a role he actually played, how much control he had, how innovative he was with cabinet deliberations and cabinet management. And we wouldn't know that until a lot of the documents were actually declassified. So the avoiding scandal part of the cabinet is perhaps the most fun because everyone loves a good cabinet scandal. For the first, let's say 80 years of the cabinet history, the number one scandal that people referred to was President Jackson's petticoat affair. Now, the way the petticoat affair developed is such a distinctly 19th century story. One of Jackson's department secretaries was married to a woman named Margaret Eaton. And some people thought that Margaret Eaton was a woman of ill repute, that they had had sexual relations before marriage and that she was quite scandalous. And the wives of the other department secretaries refused to socialize with her. They basically shunned her, they would not accept her invitations, and when she was present, they ignored her. Jackson was furious about this because he had felt that his wife had been subject to improper accusations as well, and it had driven her into an early grave. And so he thought Margaret Eaton was the same. And he demanded that the secretaries respect her. He demanded that the secretaries' wives socialize with her. And he demanded that the secretaries make their wives pay attention to Margaret. Now, that didn't go very well. And the secretaries refused. And so Jackson refused to meet with his cabinet for a full year. He wouldn't talk to them. He wouldn't consult with them, with the exception of Martin Van Buren, who conveniently was a bachelor. So he didn't have a wife that he had to force to socialize with Margaret, and he was happy to be nice to her. About a year into this scandal, completely broken down the administration, Martin Van Buren arranged a system where he and John Eaton would resign and be given basically other positions in the administration. And that way, Jackson could force the rest of his secretaries to resign sort of without losing face. Jackson implemented the strategy, got a brand new cabinet, and that all broke down a couple years later when they wouldn't do what he wanted over the United States Bank. So Jackson really wanted a cabinet that would do whatever he said, would never disagree, would never offer alternative perspectives. And it led to one of the largest scandals that really consumed Washington, D.C. Culture and politics for the better part of a year. That was, as I said, the leading scandal until the post-war years, when Andrew Jackson inherited Abraham Lincoln's cabinet, including Abraham Lincoln's secretaries that were often much more pro-civil rights, pro-Reconstruction than Johnson was. Now, whenever your cabinet leads to an impeachment, that's generally not a very good sign of cabinet interactions. And Republicans in Congress, recognizing that Johnson maybe wanted to get rid of some of these secretaries, passed a new law saying that that he could not do so without congressional approval. Well, he thought that that law was inappropriate, and so he fired the Secretary of War, who was one of the more ardent pro-civil rights forces in the government. When he did fire that secretary, Congress drafted up the bills of impeachment, and they went through the House, and then they went to the Senate for adjudication. Johnson was indeed acquitted, although there's some speculation that he maybe bought off some of those votes. Historians are sort of digging into that a bit more. And then once he was acquitted, the Secretary of War did resign, recognizing that the system was basically untenable. But it slowed down the administration for several years. It was a huge clog in the system, and it was incredibly damaging, rightfully so, to Johnson's reputation. The one on the right is a little bit more peculiar. James Monroe was the president in an era of good feelings when there was only really one political party that was operating. Now, of course, people didn't necessarily agree, because even if there's only one party, there are often regularly disagreements within that party. And he had put together a cabinet of basically leading voices within that one party. Everyone from John C. Calhoun to John Quincy Adams. Now, it's pretty amazing to imagine both of those people in the same cabinet, but it really worked for Monroe's first term. Things got a little bit trickier in the second term when it was clear that he was not going to run for a third. He was going to follow Washington's example. And pretty soon, almost everyone in his cabinet was running for president. And so you can imagine that didn't go very well in cabinet meetings when they were all jockeying for an outcome or a position that would help their candidacy. So it really sort of tore apart his administration in the final years, made it very difficult for him to get anything done, because he didn't want to be appearing to take sides with any one person or giving any one person too much of a leg up. And it was sort of one of the downsides of having a cabinet full of rivals. Now, finally, that diversity piece. Now, I know looking at this picture, you might think that's 5 white guys. That's not particularly diverse by 21st century standards. And you would be correct. However, in 1789, when Washington put together his cabinet, only white men were considered citizens. So the candidate pool was much smaller to begin with. Second, Washington, his contemporaries, understood that he had made a very intentional choice to put together a cabinet that represented the different parts of the country, the different educational, factional, economic, cultural, political interests of the country. So here's how that worked. Henry Knox had originally been from Boston. He was self-educated. He didn't come from family money. He didn't go to university, and he had made his home in one of the newer states in Maine. Alexander Hamilton, of course, came from the Caribbean. He had made his home in New York City, had cozied up to the New York merchant elite, and he was known to sort of be sympathetic to some of the big, what we would think of as the big money interests. Thomas Jefferson came from a wealthy plantation-owning family. He was from Virginia. He was known to speak for the human farmer and, of course, the people who owned enslaved individuals. And Edmund Randolph also came from Virginia, and he was also from a wealthy family, but he had personally inherited a lot less. So he was a little bit of a different Virginian, if you will. So you can see how they sort of represented different aspects of the country. They also came from different, they were all Christian. None of them were Catholic, but they did come from different Presbyterian sects. Now, Washington basically had 3 categories that he wanted each department secretary to check when he was thinking about how he was going to appoint them. First, he had to know them, because of course, if you're going to take someone's advice, it's helpful if you trust what they have to say. Second, he wanted them to have knowledge and experience and expertise that was different than his own. So Washington had never been to France. He had never been to Great Britain. He had never been to Spain. He had never held a diplomatic position, nor did he speak French, which was the language of diplomacy at the time. So he was very attentive to making sure that his Secretary of State did have those experiences, did have that ability, did have the sort of skills and knowledge to be able to speak to what it was like to do diplomacy at Versailles or the court of St. James. Similarly, he was not a brilliant legal mind. He hadn't gone to law school. He hadn't had legal training. And Edmund Randolph was a brilliant legal mind. In fact, he was so well respected that Jefferson and Hamilton, who both were trained lawyers, frequently went to Randolph for his interpretation. So that was sort of how he thought of that second factor. And finally, it was this diversity piece, thinking about a way to try and bring together the nation at a time when nationalism was not a thing. The flag was not a symbol like it is today. There were very tenuous ties between the states, and emotional bonds between the American people and the United States were non-existent. So one way that Washington could ensure that Americans felt heard, felt a part of, felt represented in his administration was through cabinet diversity. Now, this concept is one that most of Washington's successors have adopted and embraced. Now, of course, this is going to evolve and expand as our definition of who counts as a citizen evolves and expands. And in some ways, the cabinet is a marker of citizenship and belonging in the United States. So a couple of examples here. On the top right, we have Abraham Lincoln, his, of course, famous team of rivals. Now, I should say that every president up to Lincoln did put their political rivals in the cabinet. That was sort of common practice. What made Lincoln so remarkable was that he was the least known and perhaps least experienced of all of the people he had in his cabinet, which made his political genius so remarkable. But again, he had that same diversity concept. So he had Edward Bates as his attorney general, who was from Missouri, a very important border state, the farthest western state that had ever been represented in the cabinet, and a very important voice for Union sort of loyalty going into the war. He had former Democrats like Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, represented in the cabinet as well. He had sort of staunch, more radical Republican views represented by Salmon Chase in the Secretary of the Treasury position. And then he had sort of the old guard Union New York position represented by William Seward in the Department of State. So he really pulled together every element of the Union that he could find to try and hold them together as the threat of civil war emerged. On the top left, we have FDR's cabinet. FDR was the first president to include a woman. Frances Perkins was the Secretary of Labor for the duration of FDR's presidency. She was particularly attuned to the plight of women and children workers. She was perhaps, I think, the most influential and important Secretary of Labor we've ever had in terms of the enormity of her agenda and how much of it she actually got done. And she did all of that with the burden of the expectations of future potential candidates that were women that wanted to be in the cabinet, recognizing that if she failed, that might be held against people that came after. Now, the first African-American secretary was under Lyndon Johnson. The first Asian American secretary was under President Clinton. And so we've sort of tiptoed towards more representation over the course of the 20th century. Until President Biden's cabinet, President Obama's was the most diverse. You can see sort of the full scope of representation in the cabinet, including things like religion and educational background and economic background, and of course, race and gender. But what most presidents recognize is that the United States is so big and there are so many ways to be an American that no one person can actually understand all the walks of the American life. You can't actually live in those different places and fully comprehend them. So presidents recognize that the cabinet is an opportunity to make sure you are hearing from people that can speak on behalf of the different parts of the American experience, to make sure that their ideas and their needs are represented. And if that isn't enough as a selling point for diversity in the cabinet, studies have shown that diverse groups tend to avoid groupthink and think out of the box and come up with more creative solutions, which Washington recognized in 1789, and most of his predecessors have embraced as an excellent example to expand upon and to try and make their own.